Afternoon. So thank you for the very good introduction, Natalia. I'm going to be talking about our e-survey, and let me move straight to the next slide. We carried out this e-survey at the beginning of April to capture the immediate economic and social effects of the crisis. And we were, in fact, the first agency to field such a large online e-survey, very timely, resulted in a lot of media attention. And I have to say, it's been a great teamwork with colleagues from throughout Eurofound participating in this exercise. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we set it up, and then I'm going to share some results with you, and then I'm going to also tell you what's next. So how did we carry out the survey? Well, basically, we used mostly existing questions from our European Quality of Life survey and our European Working Conditions survey. These are two long-standing surveys that we've been carrying out at Eurofound. The European Working Conditions survey goes back to 1990, in fact, and the European Quality of Life survey was first fielded in 2003. And so we used the questionnaire for this e-survey with questions from these two surveys, but also with questions from EU-Silk, and with some new questions. The questionnaire was developed in English, but the survey was made available in 22 languages, ranging from Bulgaria to Swedish, so basically all the official EU languages. And we used the European Union Translation Survey for this, but because many of our questions come from the EQLS and the EWCS, we used those translations that have gone through a very thorough and scientific translation process. When it comes to participation, as I said, it's an online survey, so it means that we didn't have a sampling frame to select or ensure a good cross-representation, which means the survey is basically open to anyone aged 18 and over across the world, but our focus has been on people in the EU. Because we don't have a sampling frame or a register from which to randomly draw people to take part in the survey, we used a snowballing method, which means that you pass the word. So one person hears about it, passes it on. But to ensure also as broad as possible a coverage, we used our official Eurofound channels. So we used our management board, our stakeholders throughout Europe, our advisory committee members. And then in addition, we used advertisements on Facebook. And so users of Facebook would see ads inviting them to take part in the survey. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that we used a online tool to host the survey. And in fact, rather than going for the traditional sort of Survey Monkey or Qualtrics, we used a academic tool run by two academics in Germany, and it's been extremely useful, I must say, to use this tool. So if we move on to what this actually means, this probabilistic sampling. As I said, it's non-representative, but we used ex post weighting to correct for that. As you know, the people that participated in this survey had to have internet access, so that creates a certain amount of bias. The good news is that, of course, nowadays, many people have access to the internet. So you do cover a higher share of the population, but you don't cover everyone. So because we used ex-post weighting strategy, we find that the differences that you would get between online and offline surveys are actually quite limited. And our sampling strategy was based on your typical socio-demographic variables for which we have information. So gender, age, education, residence have been used to reduce the imbalances between the real population and our survey population. Now, we compared it against a very famous online survey that was led by Harvard and Cambridge, the COVID-19 study. And if you look at the results of those two surveys, you actually see that in terms of sampling, we've done more than they have done, and also in terms of weighting, we are very similar. So we feel quite confident that at least we meet the same standards of a survey or a study that was launched by academics at Harvard and Cambridge. So let me tell you a little bit about the first wave of the survey. As you can see on this slide, that wave was fielded when most countries were in lockdown. It was from the 9th of April until the 30th of April. And what we did is we had a very short online questionnaire of 32 questions. And our aim was to investigate what the impact of the pandemic has been on three areas: on people's well-being, on work and telework, and on living conditions and people's financial situation. Briefly, I will share later on if you want the full questionnaire with you. But when it comes to well-being, we didn't just cover sort of the standard simple questions like life satisfaction and happiness. We also include the WHO-5 mental health index, so the World Health Organization mental health index, which measures the risk of depression. We had questions about resilience and questions about optimism. Then when it comes to work and telework, here we looked at the impact of COVID on employment. We know that the lockdown had a huge impact on the economy. So we had questions that asked, in fact, whether people lost their job or contract, whether people saw their working hours reduced on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we asked whether people were able to work from home and what kind of impact this has had on their work-life balance. And then the last section includes questions about people's actual living conditions and financial situation. And we also know that that COVID has had a huge impact on that because people lost jobs and income. Next, you see that we were able to get over 62,000 clean responses from people in the EU. And in 19 member states, we actually have more than 1,000 respondents, and then over 600 in 8 other member states. And I think the interesting thing of this study is that we have included a panel component. So in wave 1, we asked people to leave their email address so that we could follow up. And of the 62,500, close to 30,000 provided their email address. This is really good because it enables us to look at to do a longitudinal analysis of what COVID has meant for living and working in Europe. Because in June, at the end of June, we launched Wave 2. And in Wave 2, we are actually looking at people's situation post-lockdown. We have now included a longer questionnaire with mainly new questions from the European Working Conditions Survey on issues that matter at this point in time, like teleworking, like self-employment, health and safety at work, whether people were received support, whether they applied for it, and what it means to that for them, and then also questions about online schooling, about seeking health advice online, and many more new questions. And from all the panel respondents that took part in wave 1 were recontacted, and so far we have just over 12,000. As for the new respondents, so we wanted to obviously also attract new people, so we used the same sampling methodology again, a snowballing. We used our network and we placed ads on Facebook, and so far we've got just over 10,000. And you will notice that these figures are lower than in wave 1, and we believe a possible explanation for that, several explanations for that are available. First of all, the novelty of COVID has sort of disappeared. People are a little bit tired, perhaps, of talking about it, but people are also busier again. It's less easy to find people at home. Life is slowly continuing to normal. However, the good news is that we do have at least sufficient responses in each country, in each member state, to break our analyses down by country, and we have attracted over 5,000 new panel members. So that's a good development. As I said before, we got a lot of media coverage, both from the written press, you can see here, Le Monde, but we also made it to the New York Times. And I just wanted to share with you that we also got other forms of coverage, media coverage, because today the European Parliament, they published their infographic at a glance, and in there they look at life before the corona and during corona, and to do so they actually were referring to our survey, which we were very happy with. If I then go back to my presentation, it's a nice way of leading you into our key findings that I'll share with you. So what we found is overall a decrease in well-being. We saw high levels of loneliness and depression. As you all know, and not surprisingly, there was an increase in telework and all the positive and not so positive affiliations of telework, particularly at a time when people were also homeschooling their children, so very challenging for families. People expressed feelings of insecurity about their jobs. There was a dramatic decrease in working time. Overall, when you look at the economic situation, it was a very stark picture, and considering that the survey was fielded at the early phase of the COVID, we are expecting this to possibly become even worse now that more people may have heard that their contract will not be renewed, or even people with permanent contracts could be at risk of losing their job. So overall, low levels of optimism and low trust in the EU and in national governments. So just a quick glance of some results. As you can see, 5% of respondents reported losing their job permanently in April, and 23 said they temporarily lost their jobs. There are huge differences between the countries, with Greece showing very high proportions. What we also see is that, we know from Eurostat, from official statistics, that women will be harder hit. Why? Because the sectors that have been hardest hit by this crisis so far are sectors that are heavily female-led or employed. So sectors like tourism or hospitality are sectors where women work more. And in the previous financial crisis, it was more men. It was construction that was hit more. So there you saw a different situation. What we have seen from the survey now is that the imbalance that existed when it came to teleworking between men and women has sort of gone away. So almost just as many women as men now started to telework. Then the next result is very impressive, well, in a not positive way, that 50% of respondents say that their working hours decreased. And in fact, the majority of that group say their working hours decreased a lot. And then, well, what does that mean for people? It means that almost 40% reported their financial situation to be worse than before. And if we compare this figure to surveys that were carried out prior to the onset of COVID, it's really much, much higher. So traditionally on our EQLS, we find around 20% thinking that their financial situation is worse than before. What we always find is a similar country pattern, and that was very reassuring in terms of the validity of this data, that the country patterns are the same. So countries like Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Sweden, they tend to be positive. And then countries like Bulgaria, Greece, Hungary is where the concern lies. So, but if you go into more detail, you do find interesting developments. So you do see that countries that were hit by the crisis, like Italy and Spain, would normally not feature so far to the right of the spectrum. Okay, and then the last issue that I want to share with you, the last results are about trust. We asked 5 different forms of trust. And as you can see, trust in the healthcare system and trust in the police is fairly high. Conversely, trust in the government and trust in the EU is low. And what was interesting at this stage was to see that trust in national government was actually, I don't know if it's statistically significant, but it was slightly higher than trust in the EU. And this is not the pattern we typically find. And we believe at this stage it can be explained that at a time of crisis, people do tend to resort to their government for explanation, for support, and for trust. So we don't know what's going to happen next in wave 2, whether trust in national government may have gone down as governments are now needing to take measures that may be less popular than in the beginning, although it may be too early yet. So what I wanted to do briefly, I know I need to hurry up a little bit, but we also have a data visualization tool, and I invite everyone to use that. It's very interesting, and it allows you to look at the results yourself. So you can play with the data and you can see scores for countries, for different groups. So you can do it by chart type. You can select your question, then you can do it by country, by gender, or by age, and you can look at the results for different categories. So I wanted to inform you of that briefly. And then if I go back to my presentation, I also would like to let you know that you can have access to the data, early access. we will be publishing our report in September. Until then, the data is under embargo, but if you sign a confidentiality agreement together with a short proposal of what you would like to do with the data, we will send you the data files together with some explanatory notes, and you can then analyze it in R, SPSS, or STADA. And in order to do so, please address yourselves to my colleague, Sarah Farrell. Last but not least, what's next? I've put the hyperlinks in so you can find the information, but we published first results. We've written a technical report in which a lot of the things I've said today are described in more detail. You can find a link to many of the events we've done. We've written blogs, country fact sheets, and I finished by letting you know that we are planning to field a third wave of the survey in the autumn to see what happened, to follow up again on our panel respondents. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Daphne. Maybe just to complete what you said on data, the first results, I assume, are available without a request, right? Directly downloadable from your site or from the Open Data portal, while the request is needed just for the ongoing survey.
No, the first results, because we are going to write up in our report the comparison wave 1, wave 2, data for the first results can also not be published yet.
Thank you, Daphne. And now we pass floor to Tina, who will be presenting the PolicyWatch database with national responses to COVID-19. Tina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia and colleagues, and thanks for the interest in this COVID-19 EU PolicyWatch database. Can I just check that you can see my slides?
Yes, please go ahead, it's
okay,
fine.
Perfect. So what I wanted to cover in the next 10 minutes or so is to give you a brief introduction into the database, to let you know why we decided to put together this PolicyWatch database, how we gather the information, what some of the main challenges were that we faced in deciding, first of all, how to construct the information and then how it should be searchable, and the kind of solutions that we've developed, how we have used the information so far. I'll give you a very brief demonstration of how you can also access and use the database, and then what we foresee in terms of next steps. So we devised this database when it became clear very early in February and March this year that we are entering quite an unprecedented situation, and that it was going to be necessary for policymakers and others to keep track of the kind of measures that can be introduced to mitigate the impact of COVID. And we wanted to have a database which was very accessible and could keep track of the evolving policy developments to allow for the sharing of information and eventually also policy learning. When we launched the database on the 18th of May, we had already over 500, we call it cases here, but it's 500 different policy measures listed on the database. Now, you might ask yourself, why another collection of COVID-19 measures? Many of you will be aware that as the situation evolved, a lot of different organizations developed similar information collections. So, for example, the ILO, the OECD, the European Commission. It seemed like everybody was entering this sphere of trying to record the kind of policy measures being introduced. What we felt was different about our approach is, because of the mandate of Eurofound monitoring living and working conditions, unlike some of the other data collections, we didn't just cover measures addressing workers or businesses, but also specifically support measures for citizens more generally. We also felt that a number of the efforts to collect information were not strictly as user-friendly maybe as they might be. So if they were not in database format, they weren't easily able to be interrogated, searching, for example, for different policy measures, different target groups, different countries. Obviously, that tended to be possible, but because you were generally accessing a large list of listed policy measures rather than something in database format, it wasn't very easy to search. Also, very often there isn't much detail or indeed much contextual information offered, which we felt was a shortcoming. The need for regular updating was very clear because measures tend to come and go as the pandemic develops and responses to it. And as I said, when it's not in the format of a database, it tends to be quite difficult to analyze both quantitatively and qualitatively. And we felt that made it difficult to get a good comparative overview of measures if you wanted to consider different types of policy approaches. Just a few words about how we collect this information. We are fortunate at Eurofound in the way that we have an established network of correspondents who are experts in the area of labor market, industrial relations, and social policies for their countries. We have these correspondents in all the member states, as well as Norway and the UK. And there is an ongoing existing contract with them, which made it easy for us to request this information at relatively short notice. So that information on policy measures was requested from them in March. We then had a two-stage process of ensuring the quality of that information internally. So we made sure that the policy measures they were recording were complete in the sense that there was comparability with similar databases. No major policy measures were missing. And we had country desks as well as thematic desks, again, checking the information. So from our internal staff, country level experts, as well as experts, for example, on themes like teleworking, short time working, looking through the information on the measures to make sure that it was complete, as well as accurate, as well as performing an editorial check. So that whole process took, I would say, only around a month for publishing in the end a database with around 500 policy measures. I think that was a very quick turnaround. In terms of challenges and solutions, obviously it's always going to be difficult to be comprehensive and complete. It wasn't going to be possible to list absolutely every policy measure, particularly in a pandemic which has quite a sectoral impact. We were never going to be able to, for example, capture all the smaller sectoral measures which might have been developed on a more targeted level. So there was a need to prioritize, and we decided in the end to begin by focusing on the larger scale measures, and then in future updates to narrow it down and to include additional elements. One of the most difficult things, I would say, was the categorization of measures under meaningful headings. And We ended up with a limited number of headings. I don't want to go into all of them, but for example, headings like ensuring business continuity, supporting businesses to stay afloat, employment protection, prevention of social hardship. So we worked very hard to develop these meaningful headings and to describe very clearly what kind of subcategories of measures we wanted to collect under those relatively general headings. Now, another reason why this is quite complex is that when you take, for example, a measure like short-time working arrangements, we have categorized this under employment protection and retention. Arguably, it's also a measure that can help support businesses to stay afloat. So you have to be quite clear also in guiding your national correspondence in how these policy measures should be categorized. There was obviously a diversity of sources and still at the beginning a slightly different way of completing the database on the part of our correspondents. So it was very important to have good quality control in place because it's garbage in, garbage out. If you don't categorize your measures well, you're never going to get a good filtering at the end when you want to select specific target groups or specific types of measures for further research. And that was the next challenge. That was the prioritization of fields for filtering. So, for example, in terms of target groups, how many groups did we want to list and what should those be? That was quite a difficult decision. I give you one example. In the beginning, we didn't include platform workers, for example. We had a category called non-standard individuals with non-standard employment contracts. With hindsight, you might say, should we also have included platform workers as a subcategory because there is such a large policy interest? So these kind of decisions were also very important. And then, of course, the need for regular updating. So what we're doing at the moment, we had the first cycle in April. We are currently updating again, and there will then be another round of updating in July. What have we prepared so far? The biggest output, if you like, is the report on policy responses to COVID-19. Again, I have put the links in here so that you can find them easily. We have produced articles, for example, on platform workers, on telework, on undeclared work, and we have targeted databases. I mentioned here, for example, the restructuring instruments, support instruments database, where there is a close link with COVID-19. We also have another database which lists restructuring events, which some of you may also be interested in. And then we've held webinars, for example, on the labor market impact of COVID-19. Very, very briefly, what the database shows is that both the EU and member states have reacted very swiftly to this crisis. When we initially launched, there were 300 new and 200 amended measures. And the main priority was understandably to support businesses to stay afloat, to protect incomes and to protect employment. And in the area of protecting employment, I'll just highlight here short-time working. And I think one of the benefits of the database, this is a very generalized picture of the income replacement rates offered by short-time work allowances, but the database gives you a very clear insight onto the huge variety and level of difference there is between the replacement rates offered to individuals on such short-time working schemes. Another thing we wanted to focus on, and I'll come back to that for the future development of the database again, Because of the tripartite nature of Eurofound, we are particularly interested in the involvement of social partners in the development of these policy measures. And one thing that I found very interesting is that in over half of the policy cases, there was either no social partner involvement or social partners were only informed, which I think is a lower level of involvement than you would usually find. So I think that the speed with which a policy response had to be developed had some impact on the level of social partner involvement. In terms of what's next, as I said, we're updating the database at the moment. That is to add any new measures that have been implemented since the initial launch, but also, and importantly, to provide more information about the take-up of the existing measures, which there wasn't very much information on when we started in April. And then with the next round of updates in September and October, we want to focus in a bit more detail on social partner initiatives, collective agreements, and other types of agreements. Then the next larger output from this whole exercise is going to be a report called Some Implications for Employment and Working Conditions, which will look in much more detail at the employment impact of COVID-19, but it also selects 3 types of policy measures to be analyzed in much more detail. So we will look at hardship funds, we will look at measures targeted at self-employed, and we will look at short-time working schemes and analyze in much more detail to what extent they have been taken up, how helpful they have been in supporting their target groups. Now, if there is a little bit more time, I just wanted to show you very briefly how you can use the online material. So this is the web page of the PolicyWatch database. And if I just scroll down here, you will find the information about how many measures there are according to different categories. And if you click on these, it will open you another page, which gives you very easily a quick overview of these types of measures. You can search it by country, you can search by subcategory, you can search by target group. And you can do the same for countries. I won't show you that now, but then I will show you the main page of the database. And here you have the categories. I think what I'll show you, so for example, for sectors, one of the sectors that has been particularly hard hit is creative arts and entertainment. So for example, you can search for this particular subsector here. You will see there are 30 policy measures addressed specifically at this sector. And you can do the same for target groups. So for example, if you're interested in all measures targeting self-employed, you can search here for that target group, and it gives you very quickly an overview of all the measures adopted in different countries. Now, if I just go back very briefly for my final slide, this is all the information that you can already access, which is the database itself, the policy responses report, and then there's the possibility to already register for the next report, which is due to come out early next year, which has that more detailed policy analysis. But I think that's all I wanted to say for now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Tina and Daphne again. The questions we got are related a bit to the methodology and the follow-up on your data you are collecting. So, for example, you mentioned that PolicyWatch database shows that reactions of EU and member states policy measures were quick and swift, while the survey showed that there is decreasing trust in the media and you. Are you somehow connecting both of your collections to understand why the survey shows these results, while actually we can see on the policy measures that reaction was swift?
If I may answer, that's a good question, and we certainly will try to link the two. Although I think we have to be also a little bit careful. So with the survey, we paint a general picture, and again, I think it shows the general sentiment. But I would be careful of making too close a connection in causality terms of what a country is doing and how people are feeling, also because they don't necessarily go in parallel. But for wave 3, which would be in November, we might have a better picture of what countries have done. Because the other thing is that supposedly many of the real measures will be taking place then. So at the moment there's still a lot of support measures, but the real consequences might happen a bit later.
So I think we can really invite participants to participate in the third wave of the survey to share how they are feeling nowadays in terms of working and living.
Yes, thank you. That's great.
Yes. And regarding PolicyWatch database, we have a question. If you are looking at the real numbers of COVID cases and how the countries react, because it can be also interesting analytical parallelism there between the number of cases and policy measures.
Yes, I think that's an aspect we will definitely take into account when we draft the next report. It was not something that we looked at specifically for the very quick mapping report that we produced in April. But I think, in terms of cases and policy response, and also the speed of easing of the emergency measures, it's important to draw the timeline, and we will do that for the next report.
We have a question if the measures listed in database are exhaustive. I think you mentioned it in already.
I think it's not possible, as I mentioned briefly, to be completely exhaustive. As I said before, we try to focus on the kind of big ticket policy measures to begin with, but that doesn't mean that there aren't also smaller, and as I showed briefly, more sectoral measures mentioned as well. And we will continue to add to it, and not only do our correspondents add to it, but when we internally identify a measure through the media monitoring, we will point the attention of the correspondent to that measure and say, you should include this because it seems like a significant measure. So yes, I can say it's not exhaustive, but we try to include all the most critical measures.
Mm-hmm. Maybe last question before we close, because we are slightly over time, is if the database provides visualizations, and the same we can ask for the survey, if there are components which can be very easily used, for example, by journalists or policymakers and integrated in their communication. Do you foresee something like this?
For the database, we can have visualization, similar to some of the ones that I showed. So we can show a breakdown of the main types of measures. We can show, where there has been social partner involvement. We can show the main target groups. So most of the things that are on the database can be visualized indeed, yes. And that's quite simple to do.
Yeah, and for the survey, the data visualization tool that I showed, and where you have a link in the presentation, allows you to make graphs. So you can decide whether you want to download the figures in Excel, so that you can make your own graphics, or you can download standard graphs or figures from our visualization tool directly.
Thank you very much, Daphne and Tina. I think we would need to close. We are slightly over time. We can just invite everybody to look at your materials and your reports with findings and data itself, to look for data through your presentation. You provided all links, or through your European Open Data portal. So we welcome everybody to dig deeper and contact us in case there are further questions. We will forward them to Eurofound. Thank you very much. Thank you all participants.